So when I say to you, budget gaming laptop, what is the first thing that enters your mind? And I'm pretty sure I know where your thought process is gonna go, right? These things are typically poorly built, they flex all over the place, they have terrible displays, they're underpowered, and a bunch of other sacrifices are being made for them to hit a respectable price point. But the LOQ 15 actually does things quite a bit differently. But at the same time, this laptop does have some very serious limitations that you need to know about. As a matter of fact, I did a full video about what you should watch out for when buying a budget gaming laptop, and you can find that right up here. Now, when I talk about the LOQ 15, this one is somewhat unique because, and I don't even think when you're watching this video, it has made its way to North America yet, because we have the version with an RTX 5060. And right now in Lenovo's entire lineup, this laptop hits the lowest price for an RTX 5060 device. Now, despite that price, the LOQ 15 does not feel or look like most other budget gaming laptops. First of all, it is very, very thin compared to some of the other chunky boy devices that are out there, and it weighs less than 5 pounds. The other thing you need to take into account here is that, yes, it does have an all plastic design, but it is surprisingly well built. Very, very little flex in the lid, in the keyboard area. Everything here feels just so well put together. Now, there's one more thing I have to mention here about the build quality, and that is the hinge quality. When the laptop is open, there's almost zero movement in its hinge when you're typing away on the keyboard. That is excellent. The only problem is that when you close it and you're carrying it around, it sort of like flaps around like a Pac-Man mouth. I also need to mention, even though there are some images showing an RGB keyboard for this device, ours didn't actually come with it. So if you really want that RGB keyboard, you gotta make sure that the device you order actually comes with one. The other thing I should mention here, and if you haven't already seen it in some of the footage, unlike other fingerprint magnets out there on the market, you can take those Dorito fingers, put them all over, and at least the lid and the lower cover will barely show anything at all. Now, when you go inside, yes, the keyboard, it does pick up a little bit of that finger schmoo, but this is such a departure from a lot of the other laptops in this price category and higher ones that we've seen. I gotta give Lenovo a bunch of credit for their finishing of this thing. Now, speaking of that keyboard and trackpad area, I do have a couple of little commentary bits here. First of all, I'm really not a fan of the numpad. I know a lot of other people might not agree with that, but I very much prefer a centered typing and gaming experience. The keyboard though, this has got to be one of the best, if not the best keyboard in this price range. I would actually put this up against keyboards from devices that cost double and triple the amount. Basically what Lenovo has done here in the LOQ series is that they've taken all of the learnings from the ThinkPad series and also their Legion laptops and distilled it down into a little bit less expensive design. No, you don't have that beautiful feel like you have on a lot of the higher end Legion devices, but it still feels very, very good. And there's very little flex in the typing area. The trackpad, that to me needs a little bit of work. Yes, it's very accurate and it responds to touches almost immediately. Gesture control is pretty much on point from what I've seen. The only thing is for me, the left and right clicks, they lack a little bit of that crisp feedback that we've seen in some of the other Legion laptops. So far, everything is looking great. Not much in the way of criticism, but I will level one major criticism at Lenovo here. Yes, you get plenty of ports around back. So you get a couple of USB-A's, a HDMI and an RJ45 jack here, along with the power connector. That is great. I absolutely love the location of this, right? This is something that current Legion laptops are moving away from. So A1 for you. But here's the problem. The right-hand edge of the laptop holds a bunch of your most used connectors. So the lone USB-C connector is here, your headphone jack, and a USB-A is here too, but that's not too big of a deal because the other ones are out back. Left-hand side of the laptop gets absolutely nothing, which is great, right? If you are left-hand dominant and you use your left hand for your mouse. But let's put it this way. If I'm using the laptop in a constrained space and I have maybe an external SSD or a thumb drive sticking out of the right-hand side here, maybe I've got my headphones there too. Every time I move my mouse, I've got a great chance of smashing into one of those things. And to me, that is just a pain in the butt. at least give us some options on the left-hand side of the laptop, maybe another USB-C port there. So if we have a thumb drive or if we have a external SSD, it doesn't have to be smashing into our mouse hound every single time. We also have to talk about the upgrade options that the LOQ 15 gives you, because in a lot of respects, Lenovo has been pretty generous here. So first of all, to get into the chassis, all you have to do is remove 10 screws and then find an edge to pop open. And once you're inside, you're greeted by a pretty expansive number of options here. So first of all, the default installed SSD is a 2242 size, but that can actually be expanded if you wanted to a standard 2280. There's another open SSD slot on the other side that has the exact same option. So the screw and standoff can be moved from the 2280 size down to the 2242. Memory, well, that's a little bit on the interesting side, right? Because Lenovo is only giving you a single stick of memory, so it's running in single channel mode, but that gives upgrade options. You just stick in another 16 gigabyte DIMM and you're up to 32 gigs. Nice thing here is that they've also pre-installed the thermal pad for that. Otherwise, that's pretty much all you can upgrade, but that's a lot better than a lot of other designs in this category. Now, I also need to talk about some of the perceived limitations of that single channel memory. Sometimes it's massive in some creator-focused apps, but in full core workloads, it's actually quite minimal. Even gaming didn't show all that much of an impact either. And yet there were some areas where that single channel setup ends up capping frame rates well below expectations. Still though, while performance might not be quite equal, people who want to upgrade their memory will have a much easier time. I also need to talk about the pricing of the LOQ 15 a little bit, because it's a little bit up in the air. We know what the price of the RTX 5050 version is, and we've already seen quite a few fluctuations in that price on both Lenovo's site and on their partners' websites. But the RTX 5060 version, it hasn't made its way to North America yet. So for the time being, Lenovo projects that this will be a $1,300 device. But there are still some additional sacrifices that Lenovo had to make in order to keep that price. And one of those is on the CPU side. You get a Ryzen 7 250, which is a refreshed older generation Zen 4 CPU running at a maximum of just 44 watts, which puts it way behind competing devices. On the other hand, its RTX 5060 runs pretty close to NVIDIA's peak TGP before you take dynamic boost into account. The screen is another area that sees a few cuts here and there. Most of the industry, yes, even a lot of budget gaming laptops, use 16:10 screens, but the LOQ sticks to the traditional 16:9 ratio, and to me, that immediately dates it, with that big chin protruding under the panel and a lot less vertical real estate. The ironic thing here is that the chassis is actually built for a 1610 panel, but it's just not being used here. Even then, straight out of the box, there's a decent color gamut, excellent color accuracy, and a surprisingly high maximum brightness. So far, so good. It seems like Lenovo might have made the right cuts to the LOQ 15 in the right places in order to hit sort of like a sweet spot. But there is one area where I personally think that they done screwed up, and that is with the battery on this thing. It only gets 60 watt hours, where almost every single other competitor out there is using 70 watt hours or more. In some cases, they're actually using 90 watt hours. And the effect on battery life of that is just catastrophic, even less than the much less efficient Intel 13th gen devices that we're showing here. I mean, Ryzen 200 series CPUs and their predecessors, the Ryzen 8000HS series, typically they just ace battery testing, and the A16 is absolute proof of that. But here it's been kneecapped with a reduced capacity, so simple tasks like web browsing or word processing, they just eat through this thing like nobody's business. On the positive side though, guys, at least Zen 4's strengths are still able to shine through in some areas, like how it handles streaming online video. So even with such a minuscule battery, it's still able to get decent results. But it could have and should have been way, way better, especially in gaming. Look, we have a GPU that's been cut back in the power department, paired up with a hyper efficient CPU. It should be getting at least 2 hours here, but it's simply not. And that pretty much sets the stage for testing. But before we get into all the benchmarks, I really want to be transparent about the other devices that we're using here, because internally it's a little bit of a struggle. Like, I'll be transparent, right? We have focused this year very much on higher end gaming devices, and none of those will line up with a laptop like the LOQ 15. It doesn't matter if it's in price or specs or the overall power being fed to the components. We just don't have a lot of budget gaming laptops on hand right now. We're going to be rectifying that with a review or a roundup a little bit later in the year. But right now, we're going to line this up with a couple of devices that are around the same price, both with and without sales, and that cover a pretty vast number of component choices. Another thing I wanted to mention is how we're testing here at the native resolution for all of the laptops, which will show up on the left-hand side of these charts. So there's a mix of 1080p for the LOQ 15 and Acer and 1200p for the other laptops here. Unfortunately, that gives a frame rate advantage to the low resolution devices in our charts, but that's simply the reality of the laptop market right now, and actually an advantage for those 16:9 screens. We also wanted to test how these perform if they're hooked up to an external monitor. So we're also benchmarking at a normalized 1440p. Anyways, in GPU limited scenarios, the LOQ 15 gets some pretty respectable results at both resolutions, despite being up against some pretty heavy hitters, like the G16, which has a flagship Ryzen 9955HX processor and a higher wattage RTX 5060. And at times, this LOQ 15 at $1,300 even gets within striking distance of the tough A15 that's equipped with an RTX 5070. If anything, this shows you just how uncomfortably close the RTX 5070, 5060, and 5050 are to one another when it comes to overall performance. It's a virtual logjam in NVIDIA's mid to entry level GPU range, and that allows relatively affordable gaming laptops like the LOQ 15 to look pretty good in many benchmarks. But there is a bit of a problem here, and that's pricing. You see, every laptop we're showing here tends to be heavily discounted pretty regularly. These are what I'd call, I guess, sale bait. Laptops that are designed to be heavily discounted, to the point where we've seen devices like the A16 in these charts and the G16 with the 5060 hit just about around the LOQ 15's regular price. And that causes a bit of an issue because the CPU and power limited GPU combo Lenovo chose for this thing tends to let it down sometimes, like in CS2, where frame rates are obviously CPU limited at its native resolution, given the fact the 1440p results were virtually identical, and laptops with more powerful processors walk all over the LOQ. Other times you'll see a drop off in the 1% lows, but only at the LOQ 15's native resolution, since those results are, of course, CPU limited. Yes, even with an RTX 5060 laptop GPU, and this can actually lead to a loss against RTX 5050 laptops with higher end CPUs like the G16 here. Its position then jumps upwards at 1440p and becomes very competitive again. And those CPU derived performance hiccups are pretty concerning, especially here in a game that's based on the ultra popular Unreal Engine. The Ryzen 7 250, coupled with its single channel memory layout, just struggles to deliver consistent frame times. So among all the laptops that we tested for this video, I would say that the LOQ 15 has solidly mid-tier gaming performance. And for some of you, that's going to be good news. For other people, that might be a little bit disappointing. But if you sort of fall into that disappointing column, well, there is a pretty major silver lining here too, because among all of the laptops we have here, this one is actually one of the quietest. I mean, look, it's a gaming laptop, so it screams like a banshee compared to a desktop PC, but all the devices in this video, in their highest performance mode, well, this one is, I guess you would call it, the least likely to blow out your eardrums. Despite that, temperatures are very well managed, but I guess that's to be expected when you consider the GPU is running in a reduced power envelope versus some of the other laptops here. Then again, there are some really bad examples here too, like the Nitro V that runs louder, uses a 5050 running at an even lower wattage, and yet it gets a lot hotter too. Meanwhile, the vast majority of the most used surfaces on this laptop stay relatively cool. Heat is contained to areas away from the keyboard's typing zones, and all of the hot air gets exhausted out the back instead of being blasted towards one of your hands if you have a mouse. It's a pretty well designed setup, and it's one that's been used for years on the Legion side. Anyways, we know the LOQ 15's CPU of choice here. It does lead to, I guess you would call it, some major bottlenecking in some games. But does that actually lead to it sort of falling behind the rest of the pack when it comes to real world productivity benchmarks. And I think Cinebench, it sets the stage pretty well. The Ryzen 7 250 is a mid-tier CPU using an older architecture that's mostly focused on efficiency. So it beats the Intel 13th gen chips, scores just under the Ryzen 9 270, and gets just dominated by AMD's newest designs. That even carries over into the single thread results. And I know you might be thinking we're stacking the deck here with two 9955HX models, but both of those routinely go for about the same amount of money as Lenovo is charging for the LOQ 15. So if you're looking for CPU performance that's leaps and bounds better than what's being offered here, there's certainly some options out there. On the other hand, I'd choose the LOQ 15 any day over the two laptops here with Intel's 13th gen CPUs. It's better in literally every single metric. There's also, of course, a few instances where this laptop's single channel memory contributes to slow things down even further. You might not realize it, but it is happening. For evidence of that, just look at how the two G16s match up against one another. The 5060 version uses a single 16GB memory layout, while the 5050 has a pair of 8GB DIMMs running in dual channel mode. And yet, if we inject a bit of GPU acceleration into these results, the LOQ 15 starts to look a heck of a lot more tempting. It can easily beat anything with an RTX 5050 and actually gets pretty close to the 9955HX RTX 5060 combo too. Naturally, as we move towards more hybrid scenarios that combine both CPU and GPU workloads, the LOQ starts falling behind yet again, but it's still quite competitive. The only area where it really starts falling behind everything else is in Premiere, where the Nitro V pushes ahead since Intel's integrated media encoder helps accelerate this workload beyond what AMD can ever offer. So in the grand scheme of things, where does this leave the LOQ 15? Because to me, in a lot of ways, this is a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type laptop. For every amazing point, there's a counterpoint that is not so great. But it does do a lot of things right. Things like really good build quality for the price, one of the best keyboards in its price category, a decent screen, though personally I prefer the extra vertical space 1610 panels give you, and there's some pretty competitive gaming performance here. But it does fall flat in the connectivity department, and frankly, I mean, look, its battery life is what I would call embarrassing. But I think the biggest area here where Lenovo is going to have some headwinds is with its price. Because given the current landscape of lower priced gaming laptops at $1,300 in the US, the LOQ 15 just makes no sense. Not when other much better, higher performing alternatives with significantly better battery life regularly go on sale for about the same amount. But maybe that's Lenovo's plan all along. Have a regular price that's so high that when it does get a discount, the LOQ 15 ends up looking infinitely better. Because let's talk about in hypotheticals here. If the LOQ 15 with the RTX 5060 ends up hitting, I don't know, around the $999 mark once sales come into effect, well, this could be an excellent bang for your buck. But until it gets to that point, there are alternatives out there that you should probably look at before jumping onto the LOQ 15 train. So anyways, with all that being said, I'm Mike with Hardware Canucks. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day, guys.